The morning mist clung to Windsor Castle like a shroud of secrets, but nothing could hide the truth that would soon shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. What happened during those final moments before Catherine, Princess of Wales, disappeared from public view wasn't just a royal withdrawal. It was a moment so profound that even the stoic guards who had witnessed decades of royal drama found themselves struggling to maintain their composure.
This is the untold story of courage, vulnerability, and the human heart behind the crown. A story that begins with tears in the most unexpected places and ends with a comeback that reminded the world why sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to give up. The truth, as one guard would later whisper, was both heartbreaking and inspiring in ways that no official palace statement could ever capture. The autumn leaves scattered across the Windsor Castle grounds like fallen hopes, each one telling its own story of change and renewal.
Guard Captain James Morrison had seen many seasons come and go during his 15 years protecting the royal family, but nothing had prepared him for the morning that would forever change his understanding of duty, strength, and what it truly means to serve with honor. It was October 25, and the early morning air carried a crispness that made everything seem sharper, more defined. The kind of morning where every sound echoed differently, where shadows fell at angles that made familiar places feel foreign. James stood at his post near the Long Walk, the famous tree-lined avenue that stretched from Windsor Castle toward the distant horizon, watching as the first rays of sunlight painted the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. He had received the message the night before through the usual channels. The Princess of Wales would be taking what the internal communications described as her final official walk through the grounds before beginning an extended period of rest and recovery. The words were carefully chosen, diplomatic in their vagueness, but James had served long enough to read between the lines. This wasn't just any walk. This was goodbye.
The battle Catherine had been fighting was one that millions of families around the world understood intimately, yet when it touched the royal family, it seemed to carry a weight that pressed down on everyone within the castle walls. Cancer didn't care about titles or tiaras, didn't respect the careful protocols that governed royal life, didn't pause for state dinners or charity galas.
It was the great equalizer, and it had come calling at the most inconvenient time imaginable. James adjusted his uniform, straightening the red tunic that had become like a second skin to him over the years.
The familiar weight of his bearskin hat, the polished boots that reflected the morning light, the ceremonial sword at his side, all of it felt different today. Less like armor and more like costume pieces in a play whose ending nobody wanted to write.
The other guards felt it too. He could see it in the way Sergeant Williams kept checking his pocket watch, in how Guardsman Thompson's usually steady hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his post. They were all thinking the same thing. How do you say goodbye to someone who has become so much more than just another member of the family you're sworn to protect? Catherine had always been different from the others.
Not because she treated them differently, quite the opposite. She had a way of making eye contact that acknowledged their humanity, of offering a genuine smile that reached her eyes, of remembering small details about their lives that most royals wouldn't even notice.
When James's daughter had been in the hospital with pneumonia 2 years earlier, Catherine had quietly arranged for flowers to be sent, along with a handwritten note that still hung on his refrigerator at home. The sound of footsteps on gravel announced her approach long before she came into view. James had trained himself to recognize different royal footsteps: Prince William's confident stride, the Queen's measured pace, Charles's distinctive gait. But Catherine's footsteps were different this morning. Slower, more deliberate, as if she was trying to memorize the feel of each stone beneath her feet. When she finally appeared around the corner of the East Terrace, James felt his breath catch in his throat. The months of treatment had taken their visible toll. Her famous chestnut hair was shorter, thinner, hidden beneath a simple blue headscarf that fluttered gently in the morning breeze. Her face, always radiant in photographs, showed the pallor that comes with fighting battles that others can't see. But her posture remained straight, dignified, every inch the future queen she was destined to become. She was alone, which was unusual. No private secretary hovering nearby with schedules and reminders, no protection officers maintaining their discreet distance, no camera crews documenting her every move. Just Catherine, the woman behind the title, taking a solitary walk through grounds that had become both sanctuary and prison over the years of her royal life. James maintained his position, eyes forward in the traditional manner, but his peripheral vision tracked her movement as she made her way down the path that led toward the Long Walk. She moved slowly, not from weakness but from intention, as if she was trying to absorb every detail of this place that had become so significant in her life. The morning was still quiet, that peaceful hour before the castle fully awakened to another day of official duties and public obligations. The only sounds were the distant call of birds in the great park,
the soft whisper of wind through the trees, and Catherine's footsteps growing closer to where James stood. As she approached his position, something unprecedented happened. She stopped.
James had been trained for many scenarios, but this wasn't covered in any manual. Royal family members didn't typically pause for lengthy conversations with guards, especially not during what was clearly a private moment. The protocols were clear: maintain position, show respect, speak only when spoken to, keep interactions brief and formal. But Catherine wasn't following the usual protocols either. She stood there for a moment, looking out toward the long walk that stretched into the distance, her hands clasped in front of her in a gesture that seemed both royal and utterly human. James could see her profile, the way she tilted her head slightly as if listening to something only she could hear.
"Beautiful morning, isn't it, Captain Morrison?" she said softly, and James felt his heart skip. She knew his name. Of course she knew his name. She made it her business to know the names of the people who dedicated their lives to protecting her family. But hearing it spoken in this context, in this moment, felt like an honor he hadn't expected.
"Yes, Your Royal Highness," he replied, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest. "One of the finest we've had this autumn." She nodded, still looking toward the horizon.
"I've always loved this view," she continued, and there was something in her voice that made James realize this was more than small talk. There's something about the way the path disappears into the distance.
It makes you wonder what's waiting out there, doesn't it? James had never thought about the long walk in quite those terms. But as he followed her gaze, he began to understand what she meant. The avenue stretched for nearly 3 miles, straight as an arrow, until it seemed to merge with the sky itself.
It was a metaphor written in stone and soil, a journey whose destination remained hidden until you had the courage to walk it. "I imagine it might, Your Royal Highness," he said carefully, unsure how philosophical this conversation was meant to become.
Catherine turned then and for the first time looked directly at him. What James saw in her eyes would stay with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't the polished composure he was used to seeing in public appearances, wasn't the carefully maintained royal reserve that characterized most of their interactions. It was raw, honest emotion, fear and determination mixed together in proportions that seemed to shift with each heartbeat. "Captain Morrison," she said, and her voice was softer now, more personal. "I wanted to thank you, all of you, for everything you've done, everything you continue to do.
I know it hasn't been easy these past months."
James felt his throat tighten. The past months had indeed been difficult, not because of any additional duties or security concerns, but because of the emotional toll of watching someone they had all grown to care about face such an uncertain future. The guards weren't supposed to have personal feelings about the people they protected, but rules and reality were often different things. "It has been our honor, Your Royal Highness," he managed to say, and meant every word. She smiled then, and it was the smile that had charmed the world when she first appeared at William's side all those years ago. Subsections. But there was something deeper in it now. Something that spoke of hard-won wisdom and the kind of strength that only comes from facing your worst fears and choosing to keep going anyway. "I want you to know," she continued, "that whatever happens in the coming months, I won't forget this place. I won't forget any of you. This has been my home in ways that go beyond just living here."
James felt something he hadn't experienced since his military service, the urge to break protocol completely, to step out of position and offer some gesture of support that went beyond the formal boundaries of his role. But his training held, even as his heart was telling him to do something, anything, to let her know that her gratitude was reciprocated tenfold.
"You'll always have our support, Your Royal Highness," he said instead, putting as much meaning as he dared into the formally correct words. Catherine nodded, and James could see her composure beginning to crack slightly around the edges. Not breaking, but revealing the human emotion beneath the royal facade, she looked back toward the long walk. And when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Some journeys," she said, "you have to take alone, even when you're surrounded by people who love you." The words hung in the morning air like a prayer, or perhaps a promise. James understood that he was witnessing something profound, not just a royal taking a walk, but a woman preparing to face the greatest challenge of her life, with whatever strength she could gather from the places and people that had meant the most to her.
They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, both looking out toward the horizon where the long walk disappeared into possibility. James had never felt more proud to wear his uniform, or more humbled by the trust that had been placed in him. This wasn't just about protecting someone's physical safety. It was about being present for a moment that would define not just Catherine's future, but the future of the monarchy itself.
Finally, Catherine took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders in a gesture that James recognized as her preparing to return to her public self. The vulnerable woman who had shared this moment with him was being carefully tucked away, replaced by the composed princess that the world expected to see. "I should continue my walk," she said. And her voice had regained its formal tone. But there was something in her eyes that remained personal. A connection that had been forged in these few minutes that transcended their official roles. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," James replied, returning to his own professional demeanor while holding on to the memory of what had just passed between them. As Catherine began to walk away, moving with renewed purpose toward the long walk that stretched before her, James felt a profound sense of privilege wash over him. He had been allowed to witness something extraordinary, not a royal duty or ceremonial obligation, but a genuine human moment of courage and vulnerability. He watched her figure grow smaller as she made her way down the tree-lined avenue, her blue headscarf a spot of color against the autumn landscape. She walked steadily, purposefully, and James found himself thinking about what she had said about journeys that must be taken alone. He realized that he was watching the beginning of such a journey, one that would test everything Catherine believed about herself, about her role, about what it meant to serve something larger than yourself even when that service demanded everything you had to give. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the castle in all its ancient glory. James remained at his post, but his mind was following Catherine down that long, straight path, wondering what strength she would find at its end, and hoping that whatever battles lay ahead, she would remember this moment, this place, and the people who would be waiting for her return.
He didn't know then that her journey would last longer than anyone expected, would take her to places darker and more difficult than the carefully worded press releases would ever convey.
He didn't know about the nights when the treatment would seem worse than the disease, about the moments when hope would feel like a luxury she couldn't afford, about the slow grinding work of rebuilding not just her health but her sense of who she was beyond her illness. But he also didn't know about the strength that would emerge from that darkness, about the way her absence would make her presence more precious when she finally returned, about the comeback that would redefine what it meant to be royal in the modern world. All James knew in that moment was that he had been trusted with something precious, a glimpse of the woman behind the crown, walking toward an uncertain future with whatever courage she could find, one step at a time down a path that seemed to stretch toward infinity. As her figure finally disappeared from view, James whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken since his military days. A soldier's prayer for someone heading into battle with no guarantee of return. It seemed like the least he could do, and somehow the most important thing he had ever done while wearing the uniform that represented duty, honor, and service to something greater than himself. The morning settled into its routine rhythm after that, but nothing felt quite the same.
James carried the weight of that encounter through the rest of his shift, through his formal duties and practice protocols, knowing that he had witnessed the end of one chapter and the beginning of another in a story that was far from over.
The leaves continued to fall around Windsor Castle, each one a small surrender to the inevitable change of seasons, but also a promise of renewal to come.
And somewhere down the long walk, a princess had begun the most important journey of her life, carrying with her the hopes and prayers of everyone who had been privileged to know her not just as a royal, but as a remarkable human being facing an uncertain future with extraordinary grace. The silence that followed Catherine's departure from Windsor felt different from the usual quiet that settled over the castle during private moments. This was a silence that seemed to echo with absence, a hollow space where laughter and footsteps and the gentle rustle of her presence used to fill the corridors with life. Guard Captain James Morrison found himself checking his watch more often in those first weeks, unconsciously listening for sounds that no longer came. The soft click of her heels on the marble floors during morning rounds with her private secretary, the distant sound of her voice drifting from the garden where she often took phone calls with various charities, the particular way she said good morning to the staff, with a warmth that made even the earliest shifts feel worthwhile. Now there was only the mechanical rhythm of official business, the measured footsteps of other family members going about their duties, and the careful whispers of staff members who spoke in lower tones, as if raising their voices might somehow disturb the delicate process of healing happening somewhere beyond these walls. The first month was the hardest. James had been through deployment separations during his military service, knew the strange ache of missing someone whose safety you couldn't personally ensure. But this was different. Catherine wasn't in a distant country carrying out royal duties where regular reports could confirm her well-being. She was fighting a battle that happened mostly in silence, in private rooms with medical equipment and treatment schedules that the public would never see. The official updates were sparse and carefully worded. The Princess of Wales continues her treatment and recovery, became a phrase that appeared in palace statements with clockwork regularity, offering just enough information to satisfy public interest while revealing nothing of the real struggle happening behind closed doors. But James and the other guards weren't the public. They had seen Catherine on her worst days. The mornings when illness from treatment made her appear fragile as tissue paper. The afternoons when determination was the only thing keeping her upright during official engagements that couldn't be postponed. They knew the difference between the carefully managed public image and the reality of what it meant to maintain royal duties while fighting for your life. Sergeant Williams, a veteran guard who had served 3 generations of the royal family, found himself sharing stories during their off-duty hours that he had never told before. Stories about the day Catherine had noticed him limping and quietly arranged for him to see the royal physician about his arthritis. About the Christmas morning when she had made sure every guard on duty received a personal thank you note along with their traditional gift. About the way she remembered not just their names but their children's names, their anniversaries, their concerns. She's not like the others, Williams said one evening as they shared coffee in the guards' break room, staring out at grounds that seemed too large and too quiet without her presence. Don't get me wrong. I'd take a bullet for any of them. That's the job. But with her, it feels personal. James understood what he meant. The royal family members they protected were, by necessity, kept at a certain distance. Professional respect and personal warmth weren't the same thing, and most royals maintained that distinction carefully. But Catherine had somehow managed to honor the boundaries of their professional relationship while making it clear that she saw them as individuals, not just uniformed figures providing a service. The second month brought unexpected challenges. Rumors began circulating among the staff, whispered conversations about treatments that weren't working, about setbacks that weren't being reported, about the possibility that the Princess of Wales might never return to full royal duties. James found himself becoming fiercely protective of information, shutting down speculation with a firmness that surprised even him. "We don't discuss rumors," he told a junior guard who had been repeating gossip picked up from the kitchen staff. "We maintain our posts and our discretion and we wait for facts." But privately, James was struggling with the same fears that were haunting everyone who cared about Catherine. The medical team that came and went from the private family quarters carried themselves with a seriousness that suggested this was more complicated than anyone was admitting publicly. The Prince of Wales looked increasingly strained during his public appearances, managing his own duties while taking on many of Catherine's responsibilities, and somehow finding time to be a husband and father through what must have been the most difficult period of his life.
It was during this time that James began to truly understand the impossible burden of being royal. The public saw the glamour, the beautiful gowns, the state dinners and charity galas that seemed like fairy tale events.
But the reality was a life of service that continued regardless of personal circumstances. A commitment that demanded you show up and perform even when your private world was falling apart. Prince William still attended his engagements, still smiled for photographs, still delivered speeches with composure and dignity. But James, trained to notice details that others missed, could see the subtle signs of strain. The way William's jaw tightened when reporters asked about Catherine's condition, the extra moment he took to compose himself before entering rooms full of people, the way his hands clenched slightly when he thought no one was watching. The children were perhaps the most heartbreaking part of it all. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis continued their schooling and activities with remarkable resilience, but James occasionally glimpsed moments that revealed the toll this was taking on them too. Charlotte's unusually quiet demeanor during family outings. George's serious expression when he thought adults weren't looking. Louis's extra clinginess with his father during public events. James found himself thinking about his own children during these observations, imagining how they would cope if their mother was fighting such a battle. The royal children had resources and support that most families could never dream of, but fear and worry didn't respect privilege. A child missing their mother was the same whether they lived in a castle or a council flat. The third month brought the first real signs of hope, though they were subtle enough that only those closest to the family would have noticed. Prince William seemed slightly less tense during his public appearances.
The medical team's visits became more routine and less urgent. Most tellingly, James heard Catherine's laugh one afternoon, drifting faintly from an upper window. Not the polished public laugh he was used to hearing during official events, but the genuine, spontaneous sound that meant she was having a moment of real joy despite everything she was going through.
It was also during this month that James received an unexpected message through the internal communication system. The Princess of Wales requested that fresh flowers be placed in the Long Walk Pavilion, the small structure halfway down the famous avenue where she had often stopped to rest during her walks. It was the first specific request she had made regarding the grounds since her departure,
and James took it as a sign that she was thinking about returning, even if only mentally. He personally selected the flowers, the same varieties she had always favored during her walks.
White roses for elegance, lavender for healing, baby's breath for hope. As he arranged them in the pavilion, James found himself remembering their last conversation, her words about journeys that must be taken alone.
She was still on that journey, but perhaps she was finding her way back to familiar landmarks. The 4th month was when the real work began, though the public wouldn't learn about it until much later.
Catherine had reached a point in her treatment where her doctors were cautiously optimistic, but her return to public life required careful planning and gradual reintegration. James began noticing subtle changes in the castle's routine private physiotherapy sessions scheduled in the family quarters, nutritionist consultations, meetings with her private secretary about managing a reduced schedule.
More importantly, he began seeing Catherine herself again, though these glimpses were brief and private. A figure in a window, looking out at the garden she had missed.
Shadow on the east terrace during early morning hours when she thought no one would notice. These weren't the confident strides of the princess he remembered, but they were steps nonetheless, tentative movements back toward the life she had been forced to leave behind.
James made sure that during these early ventures outside, extra security was discreetly positioned without making Catherine feel like she was under surveillance. It was a delicate balance, providing protection while allowing her the privacy she needed to rebuild her strength and confidence. The last thing anyone wanted was for her recovery to become a media spectacle or public relations exercise. The 5th month brought a significant milestone that only the most observant would have caught. Catherine appeared briefly on the east terrace one morning, not for a furtive glimpse of the outside world, but for what appeared to be a deliberate walk. She moved slowly, stopping frequently to rest, but her posture was straighter than James had seen in months.
Most importantly, she wasn't alone. Prince William walked beside her, not as a concerned husband hovering protectively, but as a companion sharing a pleasant morning stroll. James watched from his post, maintaining his professional stance while feeling a deep sense of relief wash through him.
This was progress that could be measured and celebrated, even if only privately. Catherine was finding her way back to herself, one careful step at a time. It was also during this month that James learned about the plans for her eventual return to public duties. The conversations he overheard between senior staff members painted a picture of careful orchestration, a gradual reintroduction that would allow Catherine to rebuild her stamina while managing public expectations. There would be no dramatic comeback, no single moment of triumphant return. Instead, there would be a series of carefully chosen appearances, each one building on the last, until she was ready to resume her full role. The 6th month was marked by what James came to think of as practice runs. Catherine began joining family events that weren't publicly scheduled, private dinners, casual gatherings, moments where she could interact with familiar people without the pressure of performance.
James noticed that her voice, when he occasionally heard it during these gatherings, had regained some of its former strength and warmth. During one of these family events, James caught a glimpse of something that gave him more hope than any official medical update could have provided. Catherine was playing with Prince Louis in one of the private gardens, and for a few minutes she seemed to forget about everything except the simple joy of being a mother spending time with her child. Her laughter was genuine and unguarded, and the way she ran after Louis slowly, but with evident pleasure, suggested that she was rediscovering parts of herself that the illness had temporarily stolen.
The 7th month brought the first hints that Catherine was thinking seriously about her public return. James observed meetings with photographers who specialized in royal portraits, discussions about wardrobe choices that would be both beautiful and practical for someone still rebuilding her strength, and consultations with her private secretary about which charities and causes should receive her first official visits. These preparations were conducted with the same careful attention to detail that characterized all royal planning, but there was something different about the energy surrounding them. Where once there had been the routine efficiency of managing an established public figure, now there was the careful excitement of preparing for a comeback that would mean something far beyond the usual royal engagement.
James found himself thinking often about resilience during this time. Not just Catherine's remarkable resilience, but the resilience of the entire royal family. They had faced this crisis with the same steadfast determination they brought to all their challenges, maintaining their public duties while supporting each other through the most difficult of circumstances.
It was a masterclass in grace under pressure, and James felt privileged to have witnessed it from his unique vantage point. The 8th month was when Catherine began appearing more frequently in the family's private spaces, and James could see that she was actively preparing for her return to public life.
Her movements were still careful and deliberate, but they carried a sense of purpose that had been missing during the early months of her recovery. She was no longer just healing. She was preparing to resume her role as a senior member of the royal family. James noticed that she had begun spending time in her office again, reviewing briefing materials and meeting with her staff about upcoming events. These sessions were shorter than they once had been, and there were more breaks for rest. But the fundamental princess who had taken that last walk down the long walk was clearly returning to herself. More importantly, James could see that Catherine's experience had changed her in ways that would make her even more effective in her royal role. There was a depth in her expressions that hadn't been there before, a gravitas that came from facing mortality and choosing to fight. She had always been compassionate in her charitable work, but now she would understand suffering in a way that would make her advocacy even more powerful. As the months of silence began to draw to a close, James reflected on what he had witnessed during this extraordinary time.
He had seen a woman face the greatest challenge of her life with remarkable courage and dignity.
He had watched a family support each other through crisis while maintaining their commitment to public service. He had observed the careful, methodical process of recovery and preparation that would soon culminate in one of the most anticipated comebacks in royal history.
But perhaps most importantly, James had learned that the qualities that make someone truly royal have nothing to do with titles or tiaras. They have to do with the strength to continue serving others even when you're fighting battles they can't see, the grace to maintain dignity in the face of uncertainty, and the courage to keep walking forward even when the path ahead is unclear.
The silence was almost over, and James found himself both excited and protective about what would come next. Catherine's return would be celebrated around the world, but for those who had watched her fight her way back to health, it would mean something even more profound.
It would be proof that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought in private, and that the greatest victories are the ones that allow you to return to the work of serving others with renewed purpose and hard-won wisdom. The morning of February 14, 2026 dawned crisp and bright over Windsor Castle, the kind of day that seemed designed for new beginnings.
Guard Captain James Morrison had been awake since before sunrise, not from duty requirements but from the kind of anticipation that makes sleep impossible. Today was the day Catherine would make her first official public appearance since beginning her recovery journey, and everyone who had been part of that silent vigil felt the weight and wonder of what was about to unfold.
The months of careful preparation had led to this moment. Not a grand state occasion or elaborate ceremony, but something far more meaningful, a visit to a children's hospital in London, followed by an appearance at a cancer research facility.
The choice of engagements was deliberate and deeply personal, reflecting both Catherine's long-time advocacy for children's causes and her recent intimate understanding of the cancer journey. James had been selected to be part of the security detail for this historic return, an honor that felt both professional and personal. He had witnessed her departure into uncertainty, had lived through the months of worried silence, and now he would be there. As she stepped back into the role that had been waiting patiently for her return, the preparations at Windsor had begun before dawn.
James could see the subtle signs of excitement among the staff. Not the usual efficient bustle of routine royal preparations, but something more electric, more meaningful. Flowers had been delivered in abundance, not just for decoration, but as symbols of celebration and renewal.
The cars were polished to perfection, not from protocol but from pride. Even the weather seemed to be cooperating, offering brilliant sunshine that would photograph beautifully and, more importantly, would feel warm and encouraging on Catherine's face.
When Catherine finally appeared in the main courtyard, James felt his breath catch just as it had during their last conversation on that autumn morning so many months ago. But the woman standing before him now was both the same person he remembered and someone entirely new. What does it mean? Physically, the changes were subtle but significant. Her famous hair had grown back thicker, and with a slight wave that hadn't been there before, styled in a way that was both elegant and practical.
Her complexion had regained its healthy glow, though there were faint lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult days. Survived. She was thinner than before, but carried herself with a strength that seemed to come from deeper reserves than simple physical fitness.
But it was the change in her presence that struck James most profoundly. Catherine had always possessed natural grace and dignity, but now there was something else, a quality that could only be earned through surviving genuine hardship.
She moved with the careful confidence of someone who had learned not to take any moment for granted, who understood the precious fragility of health and happiness in ways that only experience could teach. Her outfit had been chosen with characteristic thoughtfulness. the deep blue coat that photographed beautifully but was also comfortable for long hours of standing and walking. Her jewelry was minimal but meaningful, including a small pin from the cancer research charity she would be visiting later. Every detail had been considered not just for its visual impact, but for its symbolic significance. As Catherine approached the car that would take her back into public life, she paused near where James stood at attention. For a moment their eyes met, and James saw in her gaze a recognition that connected this moment to their last private conversation.
She didn't speak protocol, and the presence of cameras made conversation impossible, but her slight nod acknowledged the journey they had all taken together, the shared experience of uncertainty and hope that had brought them to this point. The drive to London was unlike any royal journey James had ever been part of.
Usually these trips were routine affairs, with conversation kept to practical matters and briefings about the events ahead. But today felt different.
Catherine spent much of the journey looking out at the countryside passing by, and James could see in her profile the same thoughtful expression she had worn during that final walk at Windsor. She was absorbing everything, storing up impressions and sensations as if seeing the world with new eyes. When they reached the children's hospital, the crowd that had gathered despite the early hour was unlike anything James had seen in his years of royal protection duty. These weren't the usual royal watchers who attended events out of curiosity or tradition. These were families who understood exactly what Catherine had been through. Parents who had sat in hospital waiting rooms during their own children's treatment. Survivors who recognized the courage it took to face each day during the darkest times. The signs they held weren't the typical welcome banners of royal visits. Instead, they carried messages like, "Thank you for showing us how to be brave," and "Your courage gave us hope," and "Welcome back, warrior princess." James felt his throat tighten as he read them, understanding that Catherine's battle had become symbolic for countless families facing their own medical challenges. When Catherine stepped out of the car, the crowd's reaction was unlike anything James had ever witnessed at a royal event. Instead of the polite applause and excited cheers that usually greeted royal appearances, there was something deeper, a wave of genuine emotion that seemed to wash over everyone present. Some people were crying, others were smiling through tears, and many were holding children who had their own stories of medical battles fought and won.
Catherine's response to this reception revealed the full extent of her transformation. Instead of the somewhat formal acknowledgments that characterized many royal greetings, she moved through the crowd with the slow, intentional pace of someone who understood that each interaction mattered.
She stopped to speak with a mother holding a young boy with a bald head, knelt down to talk with a little girl in a wheelchair, embraced an elderly woman who had clearly traveled far to be there. James watched these interactions with growing admiration and something that felt suspiciously like pride. This wasn't just a royal returning to duty. This was someone who had discovered a deeper purpose through her own struggle, and was now able to connect with others' pain and hope, in ways that went far beyond traditional royal sympathy.
Inside the hospital, Catherine's transformation became even more apparent. James had accompanied her on many hospital visits before her illness, and while she had always been compassionate and engaged, there had been an inevitable distance between her experience and that of the patients and families she met.
Now, that distance had vanished completely. When she entered the pediatric cancer ward, Catherine moved with the confidence of someone who understood the landscape intimately. She knew which questions to ask about treatment protocols, recognized the subtle signs of good days and bad days that families learned to read, understood the complex emotions that came with long-term illness in ways that no briefing could have prepared her for. James watched her spend nearly an hour with a teenage girl who was going through treatment similar to what Catherine had experienced.
Their conversation was private, but he could see the girl's face transform as she spoke with someone who truly understood her fears and frustrations. When Catherine finally stood to leave, the girl's mother was crying, not from sadness, but from gratitude for a connection that would help her daughter feel less alone in her own battle.
A visit to the cancer research facility later that morning provided different but equally powerful moments. Here, Catherine met with the scientists and doctors who were working to develop the treatments that had helped save her life and would hopefully help save countless others.
Her questions were informed and specific, revealing that she had spent significant time learning about the technical aspects of her own treatment and the broader research landscape. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead researcher at the facility, later told James that Catherine's visit was unlike any royal engagement she had ever experienced. She didn't just ask the standard questions about our work, Dr. Chen explained. She understood it in ways that showed she had lived with these treatments, had thought deeply about their implications. She was able to discuss the emotional aspects of treatment protocols that most people never consider. During the research facility tour, Catherine spent particular time with a team working on treatments for pediatric cancers.
James could see her absorbing every detail,
asking follow-up questions that revealed both her personal experience and her growing expertise in an area that would clearly become central to her future royal work. But perhaps the most moving moment of the day came when Catherine met with a group of families in the facility's Family Support Center. These were people at various stages of the cancer journey, some celebrating successful treatments, others still in the midst of difficult battles, some dealing with loss and grief. Catherine sat with them in a circle, and for nearly 2 hours they shared stories and experiences with a level of honesty and vulnerability that James had never witnessed in a royal setting.
She spoke openly about her own fears and struggles, about the days when hope felt impossible to maintain, about the small victories that sustained her through the darkest times. One woman whose husband was currently in treatment asked Catherine how she had found the strength to keep going when everything seemed hopeless.
Catherine's answer revealed the full depth of her transformation.
"I learned that strength isn't about feeling brave all the time," she said, her voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience. "It's about showing up for the next moment, and then the next one, even when you don't know how the story ends. It's about letting people help you when you've spent your whole life helping others. And it's about discovering that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to give up, even when giving up would be easier." James felt something shift inside his chest as he listened to these words. This was why Catherine's return mattered so much, not just to the royal family or the British public, but to anyone who had ever faced seemingly impossible challenges. She had become living proof that it was possible to walk through the darkest valleys and emerge not just intact but stronger and more purposeful than before. The journey back to Windsor that afternoon was quiet in the way that follows profound experiences.
Catherine spent most of the drive looking out at the familiar countryside, but now her expression was different from the morning's thoughtful observation. She looked like someone who had rediscovered her place in the world, who had found a way to transform personal struggle into meaningful service.
As they approached Windsor Castle, James found himself thinking about the full circle of this extraordinary story. Nearly 2 years ago, he had watched Catherine walk down the long walk toward an uncertain future, carrying her fears and hopes into a battle that would test everything she believed about herself. Today, he had watched her return to public service with a depth of purpose and understanding that could only have come from that difficult journey. When they arrived back at the castle, Catherine paused before entering, just as she had paused during that long-ago conversation. But now, instead of looking toward a horizon filled with uncertainty, she was looking back at a day that had proven something important, that her experience could be transformed into service, that her survival could become a source of hope for others, that the qualities that made her royal had been refined and strengthened by the very challenges that had once threatened to overwhelm them. "Thank you, Captain Morrison," she said quietly as she passed his position.
For everything, for all of it. But this is the book of its ancestor.
James understood that she was thanking him not just for today's service, but for being part of the long vigil that had brought them all to this moment, for maintaining his post during the months of uncertainty, for the flowers in the pavilion that had let her know she wasn't forgotten, for being a witness to both her departure and her return.
"It has been the greatest honor, Your Royal Highness," he replied, and meant it more than he had ever meant any formal response in his years of service. As Catherine disappeared into the castle, James remained at his post, but his mind was already moving forward to tomorrow, to the weeks and months of engagements that would follow, to the ways this remarkable woman would use her experience to serve others facing their own impossible battles.
The media reports that evening would focus on Catherine's appearance, on the symbolism of her return, on the public reaction to her first official engagement in nearly 2 years, but James knew they had missed the most important story. They had witnessed not just a royal returning to duty, but a human being who had discovered that the most profound service comes from transforming personal suffering into a source of strength and hope for others. That night, as James completed his final rounds of the castle grounds, he walked down the long walk where Catherine's journey had begun so many months ago.
The path that had once seemed to lead towards uncertainty now felt like a metaphor for something different, for the way that courage can transform apparent endings into new beginnings, for the way that walking toward our fears can ultimately lead us to our greatest strengths. The princess had returned, but she had brought back something more valuable than her presence alone.
She had brought proof that even the darkest journeys can lead to unexpected light, that sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence, and that the greatest victories are the ones that allow us to serve others with a depth of understanding that can only come from having walked through our own valleys of shadows and emerged ready to help others find their way. James smiled as he completed his rounds, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for service. Catherine's comeback was complete, but her real work, The work of using her experience to help others face their own impossible battles was just beginning. And he would be honored to be part of whatever came next, just as he had been honored to witness the extraordinary journey that had brought them all to this moment of hope and renewal.